The sound of the door closing still rings in my ears. It wasn't a slam, not really. A slam would have meant passion, anger, something. This was worse. It was quiet, cold, deliberate. A soft click, followed by the hollow thud of finality. I just stood there on his front porch, staring at the brass handle. My breath turned white in the winter air. The grocery bag slipped from my hands. Apples rolled down the steps and into the snow. I didn't even chase them. I just watched frozen, as the life I'd built around that boy disappeared behind a painted blue door. I remember thinking how clean it looked. That door. How well kept the house was. A house I'd never been invited into since his wedding. I told myself it was just busy schedules, new routines, boundaries. The words people use when they don't want to say distance. The porch light flickered once. A small, almost mocking reminder that I was still standing there. Alone. The truth is, I hadn't come to argue. I wasn't there to meddle. I had simply wanted to surprise him. To drop off his favorite stew, the one I used to make when he came home from school shivering and hungry. I'd even brought it in the same old pot, wrapped in a dish towel so it would stay warm. I thought he'd smile when he saw me. Maybe hug me. Maybe say, "Mom, you shouldn't have." But instead he opened the door, looked at me, really looked at me, and something in his face hardened. He didn't yell. He didn't even frown. He just said, "You should have called first," and then click. I can still hear the sound of the lock sliding into place. For a moment I didn't move. I just stared at the door, waiting for it to open again. Waiting for him to realize what he'd done, to swing it open and say, "I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't mean that." But nothing happened. Somewhere behind the curtains across the street, I saw movement, a neighbor peeking out. I turned my head quickly, pretending to check my phone. My cheeks burned. Shame is a strange kind of cold. It bites deeper than the wind. I bent down, picked up the bag, though most of the groceries were ruined. The stew had spilled through the towel, soaking my gloves. Still, I gathered what I could and walked back to my car, my steps leaving uneven prints in the snow. As I reached the car door, I whispered to myself, barely audible even to my own ears. My own son. The drive home felt longer than usual, though I'd done that route hundreds of times before. The familiar roads blurred through my tears. The world looked colorless, the kind of gray that swallows everything. I kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other on the pot beside me, still warm against my palm. It felt like holding on to something that didn't exist anymore. Halfway home, I laughed, a dry crack sound that startled even me. I laughed because I remembered when he was 6 years old, and he used to beg me to pick him up early from school. "Don't be late, Mommy," he'd say, gripping my hand as if the world could end if I let go. And now he couldn't wait to close the door on me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just grown tired of seeing it empty. I sat there in the car for a while, engine humming softly beneath me, hands shaking on my lap. There was something about that moment, the quiet, the solitude, that made me realize this wasn't just about a door. It was about everything that had been closing, little by little, for years. Before I tell you what happened next, please subscribe to this channel if you believe stories like this, stories about love, loss, and strength, deserve to be heard. Because what I'm about to share, it isn't just about heartbreak. It's about finding the strength to stop waiting on a door that will never open again. When I finally stepped out of the car, the cold air hit me again, sharper than before. My knees ached as I climbed the front steps, but I didn't rush. I unlocked my door, and walked into silence. The house greeted me the same way it always did. Still empty, echoing. I placed the pot on the counter and stared at it. The towel was stained, the stew half gone. I thought of how many times I'd made that same dish for him. On exam days, birthdays, days when he'd come home crying over scraped knees or broken toys. And I wondered, when did my care become a burden? When did love turn into something inconvenient? I sank into the chair by the kitchen window. The cold had followed me in. It always did. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder with every second. I pressed my hands together and tried to steady my breathing, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying it. The way he looked at me before closing that door. There wasn't anger in his eyes. There wasn't even disappointment. It was indifference. And that was what broke me. Because indifference isn't born overnight. It's not a storm that passes. It's a slow freezing. The kind that starts at the edges of a heart until one day, you wake up and realize there's nothing warm left to give. That night, as I sat there staring at the untouched stew, I knew something had changed. Not just between us, but inside me. I didn't cry. Not yet. I didn't shout or call or beg. I just sat there, letting the sound of that closing door echo again and again in my mind. It was more than a sound. It was a sentence. And it had finally been served. When I woke the next morning, the house felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that doesn't come from weather, but from absence. The kettle whistled faintly on the stove, but I didn't move to pour the tea. I just stood there, staring at the steam curling upward, thinking how quickly warmth disappears when no one's around to share it. The kitchen table was cluttered with little remnants of the life I used to live. An open mail, a half-finished crossword, the framed photo of my son and me on his graduation day. He was grinning then, his arm around my shoulder, eyes bright with pride. I reached out and touched the glass, tracing his smile with my finger. "Where did you go, my boy?" I whispered. I tried to shake off the memory, but everything in that house reminded me of him. The faint scuff marks on the hallway wall from when he used to race his toy cars. The dented piano key he always hit too hard when he practiced. Even the worn patch on the couch where he'd fall asleep watching cartoons, head resting on my lap. It's strange how time turns those memories into both comfort and torment. They warm you and wound you all at once. After my husband died, I thought the silence would break me, but my son's visits had kept the house alive. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway, his laughter echoing down the hall. I lived for those moments. And then one by one they stopped coming. At first it was excuses, work was busy, the baby was teething, traffic was bad. I believed him. I wanted to. But deep down I felt it, that slow pulling away, like a tide retreating so gently you don't notice until the shore is bare. I sat by the window that morning, tea gone cold in my hands, watching the snow fall in slow, silent flakes. It reminded me of the day he left for college. I'd helped him pack the car, made sandwiches for the road, slipped $50 into his jacket pocket when he wasn't looking. He hugged me tight then. "Don't cry, Mom. I'll call every day." He meant it at the time. I know he did. But years have a way of dulling promises. I could almost hear his voice in the quiet. "Mom, you worry too much." He used to laugh when I'd remind him to wear a scarf, to eat properly, to call when he got home. "Mom," he'd say, rolling his eyes, "I'm fine." And I'd smile, pretending to believe him, because that's what mothers do. We pretend. We protect. Even from the truth. The truth is, I'd seen this distance coming. Not all at once, but in small, subtle ways. A shorter phone call. A text instead of a visit. Birthdays that became quick drop-bys. Then the day he told me, gently but firmly, that I should call ahead next time. That day hurt more than I let on. I remember hanging up and staring at the phone, feeling like I'd just been told I was a guest in my own child's life. Still, I tried to stay hopeful. I baked cookies for his children, sent little gifts on holidays, tried to be careful, not too much, not too needy. But no matter how lightly I stepped, I still felt like I was walking on eggshells. I didn't understand what I'd done wrong. Was I too involved? Too emotional? To me? It's a question that keeps you up at night, wondering when love stopped being enough. The days after that slammed door blurred together. Morning bled into afternoon, and I found myself counting hours by the ticking of the clock instead of the sound of phone calls. Sometimes I'd sit in the living room, watching the light shift across the carpet, and think about how many years I'd spent building my life around other people. My husband, my son, the family dinners, the birthdays, the traditions. Now the house felt like a museum of a life that no longer belonged to anyone. I stood at the window again that evening, the sun sinking behind the trees, and thought about how quiet pain can be. It doesn't scream. It doesn't shatter things. It just settles in, soft, steady, patient, until it fills every corner of you. I made myself dinner that night. Soup and bread, simple. I set one plate, one bowl, one spoon. Old habits die hard though. I still caught myself looking toward the empty chair, expecting him to walk in, shrug off his coat, and say, "Smells good, Mom." But the only thing that came through the door was the wind. That's when it hit me. The cold I felt wasn't from winter. It was from years of waiting for warmth that never returned. And yet, in that stillness, something inside me began to shift. I realized how long I'd been holding my breath, waiting for someone else to make me feel seen again. I thought about my husband's words, from a long time ago, back when our son was still little. He used to say, "One day, you'll have to let him go, Margaret. He's not yours to keep." I used to laugh when he said that. I thought he was being dramatic. Now I understood what he meant. Letting go doesn't happen when they move out. It happens when you stop being the center of their world and start being the edge of it. That night, I went to bed without turning on the television. I just lay there in the dark, listening to the hum of the house, the pipes, the distant whistle of wind. For the first time, I didn't imagine him walking through the door. I just listened. And somewhere between the quiet and the ache, a new thought began to form. Not bitter, not angry, just clear. If he could close a door on me so easily, maybe I'd been the only one trying to keep it open. I didn't know it then, but that thought was the seed of something I hadn't felt in years. Strength. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster, thinking how much they looked like roads leading nowhere. Every creak of the old house felt louder than usual, like the walls themselves were whispering reminders of everything I'd lost. On the dresser sat a pile of papers I'd been meaning to sort through, bills, letters, and tucked between them, the copy of my will. I'd made it years ago, back when everything was simple, when I believed that love alone would guarantee loyalty. His name was written across every page, every asset, every possession, all going to him. I got up and walked to the dresser. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, but I didn't care. I picked up the will and stared at the neat lines of type, the ink that had long dried. For years, it felt like a comfort, a promise that my life's work would continue in his hands. Now it felt like a mockery. The house was silent, but inside my chest something started to stir, a small, steady pulse of defiance. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. If he could shut a door on me without hesitation, why had I spent so long keeping every door in my life open for him? I sat down at the kitchen table, pen in hand. The will lay before me, and I could almost hear my husband's voice echoing faintly in memory. "One day, you'll have to stand on your own again, Margaret." Maybe that day had come. I took a deep breath and drew a single line through his name. Just one motion, clean, deliberate. It felt heavier than anything I'd ever done. My hand trembled when I put the pen down, but inside, there was stillness. That line wasn't born out of hate. It was born out of release. I sat there for a long time, the sound of the ticking clock filling the air. The steady rhythm calmed me. It felt like time itself had been waiting for me to make that move. I thought about what it really meant to be a mother. How much of our identity is built around giving, nurturing, and forgiving. But motherhood isn't meant to be a chain. It's meant to be a legacy. And a legacy shouldn't be handed to someone who has already turned away. By dawn, I'd made my decision. The sun rose weak and pale, brushing light across the table. I dressed, made a pot of tea, and called my lawyer. "Margaret," he said after I told him what I wanted, his tone careful, cautious. "Are you sure? These are big changes." I smiled, not out of joy but peace. "I've never been more sure." He hesitated. "This isn't something you can easily undo." "I know," I replied. Neither was raising him. We agreed to meet that afternoon. When I hung up, I looked around the house. The photographs, the souvenirs, the signs of a life once full of purpose. And for the first time, I didn't feel trapped in it. I felt in control. I made breakfast, toast and jam, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. Small acts can feel powerful when you do them for yourself. As I washed the dishes, I glanced out the window at the frost-covered garden. The roses I'd planted years ago were long gone, replaced by stubborn weeds that somehow survived the cold. I realized I admired them. Weeds don't wait for permission to grow. They just do. By the time I left the house, I felt lighter. The road ahead wasn't full of fear anymore. It was full of decision. Every mile toward the lawyer's office felt like shedding a layer of something heavy I'd been wearing for too long. When I arrived, he greeted me with that gentle, hesitant smile people reserve for widows and grandmothers. The kind that assumes fragility. But I wasn't fragile anymore. Not that day. We sat in his quiet office, papers spread before us, the faint smell of ink and old carpet in the air. As he spoke, I barely listened. I just watched the pen in my hand glide across the pages, each signature sealing my choice. He asked me, "Do you want to designate someone else?" I thought for a moment, then said, "Not yet. For now, I'll leave it open. I just need to make sure my name means something before anyone else's does." When it was done, I placed my hand flat on the final document. The paper felt cool under my palm, but there was warmth behind it, the kind that comes from reclaiming something you didn't realize you'd lost. As I left his office, the winter wind met me head-on, sharp and clean. But this time it didn't sting. It felt like it was clearing the air. That was the day I stopped being a mother defined by waiting. I became a woman defined by choice. And though I didn't know what would happen next, I knew one thing for certain. That door he closed? I wasn't standing outside it anymore. I was walking toward something else entirely. The morning after I changed my will, the world felt different. Not brighter, not happier, just clearer. Like someone had cleaned the fog off the glass I'd been looking through for years. I woke early, made my bed with military precision, and opened the curtains wide. The light poured in across the living room, touching every surface that had once felt dull and forgotten. It wasn't much, but it was mine, every inch of it. I began small. First, I opened the drawer in the hallway, the one stuffed with old papers, passwords, and account statements. For years, I'd kept everything labeled for him. My son's name was on every bank access, every insurance note, every plan for when I'm gone. I took a deep breath and started crossing them out, one by one. The sound of pen on paper was oddly satisfying, a slow, deliberate rhythm of letting go. When I was done, I gathered the papers in a neat pile and locked them in a folder with my own name printed across the front. For the first time in years, I wasn't organizing my life around someone else's convenience. I was reclaiming it. Later that afternoon, I visited the bank. The young teller looked nervous when I asked to update my accounts. "Of course, ma'am. Do you have the authorized name to add or remove?" "Remove," I said firmly. "Just remove." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. I signed the documents, and when she slid the final paper toward me, I noticed my hands were steady. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Walking out of the bank, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Older, yes, but not defeated. There was something sharp in my eyes again, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Strength. Over the next few weeks, I kept going. I cleaned the house top to bottom, room by room, not because it was messy, but because it was full of ghosts. Old gifts from my son's childhood, stored with sentimental care, now felt like relics from a different life. I boxed them carefully, not thrown away, but set aside. Memory deserves respect, even when love no longer does. The living room shelf had a row of picture frames, family vacations, birthdays, the day of his wedding. I left them there for a while, unsure if I was ready to face them. But one evening, I stood before them, dusting each one, and realized that every smile in those photos belonged to a different version of us. I picked up the frame from his wedding day, his arm around me, my face radiant with hope. I whispered, "You're free now," and placed it gently in the box with the rest. The house grew quieter after that, but the silence no longer hurt. It felt intentional, chosen. When I wasn't sorting through memories, I was at my lawyer's office. We reviewed documents, adjusted beneficiaries, arranged donations. I decided part of my estate would go to a local shelter, the one that helped single mothers get back on their feet. I knew what it was like to give everything and be left with nothing. As I signed those papers, I felt something shift deep inside me. Purpose. At home, I made changes in small but meaningful ways. I changed the locks, not out of fear, but symbolism. I wanted to hear the click of a new key turning in the door, a sound that meant protection, not exclusion. The old keys, I dropped into a glass jar on the counter. They clinked softly, a final punctuation mark at the end of an old chapter. In the evenings, I found myself gravitating toward things I used to love before life became about everyone else. Gardening, for instance. My knees protested, but my spirit didn't. I pulled weeds, trimmed dead branches, planted new bulbs for spring. There was something healing about dirt under my nails. A reminder that new life comes after pruning what's dead. Sometimes, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun dip below the horizon. It used to make me sad, the light fading, the day ending. But now it just felt natural, peaceful. Not everything that ends is a loss. A week later, I walked through the grocery store for the first time without glancing at his favorite items. No more buying things just in case he visits. Instead, I filled my cart with what I wanted: raspberries, chamomile tea, a small bouquet of tulips. As I loaded them onto the counter, I smiled. The cashier looked surprised. Maybe she wasn't used to seeing old women smile for no reason. That night, I made myself dinner, a proper one. Not leftovers, not toast. Roast chicken, seasoned just the way I like it, with rosemary and lemon. I lit a candle and poured a glass of wine, even set the table with my good plates. It felt indulgent, almost rebellious, to celebrate myself. Halfway through the meal, I found myself laughing softly. For so long, I'd lived waiting for calls, visits, or even a text. I'd kept my happiness on pause, dependent on someone else pressing play. But now I realized I didn't need an audience to feel alive. In the quiet, I noticed the house had stopped echoing. Not because it was full of noise, but because I was finally filling it with presence. My presence. The next day, I went through the last box in the attic. Letters, cards, little handmade crafts he'd made as a boy. I read a few, smiled, and tied them neatly with a ribbon. Then, for the first time in decades, I let myself write a new letter. Not to him, but to myself. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. You've done enough, Margaret. You've loved enough. It's time to live for yourself now. I folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in my nightstand drawer. A promise to the woman I was becoming. By the end of that month, my world looked the same on the outside. Same house, same routines, but it felt entirely different inside. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't aching for a door to reopen. Instead, I was walking through my own. And though I didn't know it yet, the peace I'd found in those quiet days would soon be tested, because the person who'd shut me out was about to return. It happened on a gray afternoon, a few weeks after I'd signed the final papers. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that threatened rain but never followed through. I was pruning the rose bushes when I heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. For a moment, my stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting anyone. Then the car door slammed, and I knew that sound: his car, his stride, his impatience. I straightened slowly, brushing the dirt from my gloves. My son was walking toward me, jaw tight, shoulders stiff. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, but his expression was the same as the day he shut that door in my face: detached, practiced, cold. "Mom," he said sharply, skipping any greeting. "We need to talk." I nodded toward the porch. "Then talk." He hesitated, maybe surprised by my calmness. I didn't offer him tea, didn't rush to make him comfortable. We sat across from each other at the small patio table. The wind rustled the trees around us, and the silence between us grew thick. He spoke first. "I got a call from Mr. Grant. He said you changed your will." I didn't answer. I just folded my gloves neatly on the table. His voice rose. "You took me out of it? After everything I've done for you?" That made me look up. "Everything you've done for me?" I repeated, not angry, just curious. He faltered. "You know what I mean. I'm your son, Mom. You can't just." "Can't I?" I said quietly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, he didn't seem to know what to say. I leaned back in my chair. "You closed a door on me, remember?" He frowned. "That was different. You showed up unannounced. It wasn't the right time." I nodded slowly. "It rarely is when love isn't convenient." He sighed, frustrated. "You're being dramatic. You're taking this too far." "No," I said, voice steady. "I'm taking it exactly as far as you took me, to the doorstep. Only this time, I'm the one closing the door." The wind picked up, scattering a few rose petals across the porch. He ran a hand through his hair, the same way he did as a teenager when he felt cornered. I can't believe you'd do something like this, he muttered. It's cruel. I looked him squarely in the eye. Cruel? I said softly. Cruel is watching your mother stand outside your house, holding dinner she made for you, and turning the lock. His face reddened. I said I was sorry about that. No, you didn't, I said. You justified it. You always justify it. The silence that followed was sharp, almost metallic. I could see the guilt flicker in his eyes, quickly buried under pride. You don't understand how hard things have been, he said, his tone softening, shifting to defense. The kids, the job, the bills. I've got a lot on my plate. And I didn't? I asked. You think I raised you without sleepless nights? Without fear, or exhaustion, or sacrifice? The difference is, I never let that become an excuse to forget love. He looked down at his hands. You're making this into something it's not. I smiled faintly. No. I'm finally seeing it for what it is. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt heavy but clear, like the pause before a storm breaks. When he finally met my gaze again, there was something wounded there. You're cutting me out of your life for one mistake? One mistake. I said quietly. A mistake ends when someone makes it right. You never did. You let the distance grow, one unanswered call at a time. He rubbed his temples, exasperated. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, I said. That's what makes it worse. You didn't care enough to mean anything at all. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the porch boards. So that's it then? You're done with me? I took a slow breath. You closed the door first, I said. I just locked it. The words hung there, sharp and final. He stared at me, eyes flashing with anger, then pain. You'll regret this, he said under his breath. I shook my head. No, I replied gently. Regret is for those who keep hoping for change. I've stopped waiting. He stood there for a moment, torn between pride and guilt. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. His footsteps echoed on the gravel, each one a little fainter than the last. I didn't move until I heard the engine start. The car backed out, tires crunching, then disappeared down the road. The sound faded into nothing. I sat there on the porch, the air still humming from everything that had just been said. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but I didn't. What I felt was peace. Not the soft, comforting kind, but the clean, unshakable kind that comes after truth. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by what-ifs. The conversation I'd dreaded for so long had finally happened, and it hadn't destroyed me. I looked at the roses again, their petals torn by the wind, yet still standing. It struck me how resilient they were, how beauty could survive even after being cut back. I took off my gloves and ran my hand along the railing, the wood warm beneath my palm. It was over. Not just the argument, but the waiting, the wondering, the quiet ache of trying to be wanted. Inside, the house welcomed me like an old friend. The air was still calm. I brewed myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade from the sky. A thought came to me then, simple but certain. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop chasing someone who doesn't look back. And though I knew he'd be angry, perhaps for a long time, I also knew that one day he might understand. Doors don't always close to punish. Sometimes they close to protect. The next morning, the house felt different. Quieter, somehow cleaner, as if the air itself had been rinsed of something heavy. I walked through each room slowly, not in sadness but in acknowledgement. Every object, every photograph had a story. And now, I could finally decide which one still belonged to me. The will sat on the kitchen table, sealed in its manila envelope. I had left it unopened after signing the final version, afraid to look at it again, as though seeing it might make it too real. But that morning, I didn't hesitate. I opened it, unfolded the crisp pages, and read each line with calm, deliberate eyes. There it was, my signature, the seal, the official stamp that made it binding. My life, summarized and secured. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a declaration. I gathered my things and drove to Mr. Grant's office once more, this time under a bright winter sun. He greeted me warmly, as though sensing the finality of this visit. "All set?" he asked, motioning toward the papers. "Yes," I said, sliding the signed copy across his desk. "I just came to make it official." He nodded. "Once this is filed, it's legally final. Would you like a witness copy?" "No," I said. "I trust myself enough now." He smiled faintly at that, and for a moment, I could see respect in his eyes. Not the pity that often greeted me these days, but real respect. When I left the office, I didn't look back. There was nothing left undone. On the way home, I stopped by the hardware store. The man behind the counter, a kind fellow who'd known my husband, asked, "Need any help today, Mrs. Parker?" "Yes," I said, steady but soft. "I need new locks." He nodded without question, pulled a small box from the shelf, and handed it to me. As I paid, I thought of how strange it was. Something as simple as a lock could mean so much. Protection, choice, peace. Back home, I set the box on the counter and brewed a cup of tea. Then with quiet resolve, I replaced the locks myself. One turn at a time. The metallic click echoed through the hallway, crisp and decisive. Each turn of the screwdriver felt symbolic. The sound of boundaries being restored. It wasn't about keeping him out. It was about keeping my peace in. When the last lock was secured, I stood back and exhaled slowly. The air inside felt still, but not empty. It was the stillness of ownership. The kind that comes when you finally reclaim the space you live in, both physically and emotionally. Later that afternoon, I gathered a few old boxes and began sorting through them. There were photos of birthdays, graduations, holidays long past. Some I kept. Others I placed gently into a separate pile. Not out of anger, but acceptance. As I sorted, I found an old letter from my husband, written decades ago. The ink had faded, but the words still carried his warmth. "Promise me you'll never lose yourself in the people you love," he'd written. "Love them deeply, but remember, you are your own first home." I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the truth of it resonate through me. The sun began to set, painting gold streaks across the windows. I placed the letter back into its envelope, sealed it, and tucked it inside the drawer with my will. Then I whispered, "Peace," as my hand lingered over the seal. Finally signed. The words carried softly through the quiet house, settling in the corners like a blessing. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No dreams of slammed doors or echoes of cold words. Just silence, complete and kind. When I woke the next morning, the world outside was blanketed in frost. I made myself breakfast and sat by the window, watching the light catch the edges of the frozen branches. It was beautiful, still, and perfectly imperfect. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not for apologies, not for reconciliation, not even for understanding. Some chapters close because they must, not because they end neatly. The lock on my front door gleamed faintly in the morning light. I smiled. It wasn't a symbol of loss, but of sovereignty. I had locked in my peace, and that was enough. Spring came early that year. The snow melted in slow rivulets down the driveway, and small shoots of green began to peek through the soil in my garden, fragile but determined. I spent most mornings out there, hands deep in the dirt, coaxing life back into the earth. There was something healing in that, to nurture something that didn't ask for forgiveness, that simply grew because it could. One afternoon, as I trimmed the edges of a new rosebush, I heard laughter. High-pitched, genuine, bubbling with life. My granddaughter Lily came running up the path, her hair flying behind her like a banner of light. Her mother, my daughter-in-law, followed at a distance, offering a small, cautious smile. I stood slowly, brushing my hands on my apron. "Well, look who's here," I said, unable to hide my surprise. Lily ran straight into my arms, wrapping herself around me with a hug that nearly knocked the breath from my chest. "Grandma, Daddy said we could come see you today." Her words hit me like sunlight breaking through clouds. Behind her, my daughter-in-law shifted awkwardly. "I hope it's all right," she said quietly. He thought maybe it was time. I nodded, still holding Lily close. "Of course it's all right." We spent the afternoon together, tending to the garden. Lily chattered endlessly, asking about every flower, every bug, every memory the soil seemed to hold. Her mother helped me prune the edges, and though there were few words between us, there was no tension, only a tentative peace. As the sun dipped lower, Lily plucked a rosebud from a bush and handed it to me. "For you," she said proudly. "Because you make things grow." I smiled, eyes stinging. "Thank you, sweetheart. I try." When they left that evening, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full, of light, of laughter, of something that might one day become forgiveness. After they drove away, I sat on the porch and looked at the road. The same road my son had driven down in anger weeks ago. The same one he'd taken as a child, waving from the back seat after summer visits. He hadn't come today. I didn't know if he ever would. But that was all right. Not every door needs to reopen for healing to begin. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The same spot where I had once watched the world through tears. Now, I watched it with quiet gratitude. The roses outside caught the last light of the setting sun, their petals open and unguarded. It struck me that maybe life isn't about keeping everything alive. It's about knowing when to let certain things rest so others can bloom. I thought about my will. The name that was no longer there, the space left blank. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like an invitation. A space waiting to be filled by something worthy. Love that was mutual, care that was steady, family that reached back when I reached out. Maybe one day, that space would hold Lily's name. Maybe it wouldn't. But for now it was enough to know that peace was mine, earned and kept. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to my son, but to the world I'd leave behind someday. It began simply. If you are reading this, it means I have lived long enough to understand that love cannot be demanded, only offered. And that peace is not found in the company of others, but in the decision to value your own heart. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and slid it beside my will. Then I turned off the light and let the silence cradle me. In the days that followed, I found myself smiling more. I'd walk into town for groceries and chat with the cashier about her grandchildren. I joined a small book club at the library, nothing fancy, just a few women who liked stories and tea. We'd sit in a circle, reading aloud from novels about second chances. Sometimes they'd ask about my life. I'd smile and say, "It's been full, not perfect, but full." And it was. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the house filled with the soft hum of twilight, I'd sit on the porch with my cup of tea and listen to the world breathe. Birds nesting, wind through the leaves, the distant laughter of children. That was peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of balance. Some doors, once shut, keep the wind out. Others they keep peace in. Mine had done both. And as the stars began to appear one by one, I felt my heart settle into something simple and sure. A truth I wished I'd known sooner. Love doesn't always stay where you plant it. But peace grows wherever you tend it. So I stayed there, under the open sky, the cool night brushing against my skin, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd found. Myself. And if you've listened to my story, if you've felt even a flicker of what I've felt, then please subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this, stories of love, loss, and strength, deserve to be heard, remembered, and passed on.